the first thing to say about the SNP is that throughout this election campaign, and indeed for the last year, they have been miles in front of their opponents in the polls. John Curtis, who's obviously the country's leading pollster, he told my colleague Paul Hutchin last week there's basically a 1 in 100 chance that John Swinney will not be the First Minister after the election on Thursday. So it's important to caveat that about the SNP, because basically they are going to be returned to power, which means that what they're promising voters in their manifesto here, they're actually going to be expected to deliver upon. This isn't just a fantasy document. The SNP is almost certainly going to be in power. They're almost certainly going to have to try and get some of this manifesto actually, delivered. I guess there's two kind of big themes to what the SNP have been talking about in this campaign. I'll talk a bit briefly about those and we can kind of go into more detail. One, which will surprise nobody that has any knowledge of the SNP or Scottish politics, and that, of course, is independence.
Friends, I know that times are tough out there. Food prices have shot up, household bills are soaring, and filling the tank now empties your pocket. In energy-rich Scotland, people can't afford to heat their homes. In a country with more renewable power than we use, our bills are soaring. And in a country where oil and gas has sent £350 billion to Westminster, a Labour government tried to rob our pensioners of their heating allowance. Friends, the problem is not that we don't have the energy. The problem is that Westminster has the power. This election is our opportunity to take those powers and put them into Scotland's hands. Lower bills, more jobs, a greener future. That's what you get when you vote SNP.
John Swinney has been very keen to talk about independence at every single campaign event he's done. His message is quite simple. He says to voters, if you vote for my party, this is the first real step to achieving Scotland of becoming an independent country. Now, we can kind of go into the detail about that and say, is that actually a realistic or feasible prospect? But regardless, that's something that John Swinney and the SNP have been very keen to talk about, because obviously they have been in power for a very long time. They have been in power at Holyrood since 2007. There are voters going to the polls on Thursday who can't remember a time when the SNP have not been in power at Holyrood. And John Swinney himself, he's been part of that SNP government since day one. He is by some distance now. We've got a lot of experienced MSPs who've chosen to leave ahead of this election. John Swinney is by a long way the most experienced minister in the Scottish Parliament. And again, that's been something else the SNP's been very, very keen to talk about in this campaign, is to emphasise John Swinney as being the man of experience. He knows what he's doing and you can trust him. Separately to independence, though, the other issue the SNP has been very, very keen to talk about is the cost of living and what can be done to kind of help with that. I mean, again, here's just a flavour of what they're talking about in their manifesto. I mean, they're not being subtle about this. But the one thing you could say is, obviously, the Scottish Government has limited powers when it comes to things like the economy. So how can they make direct interventions to help people that are struggling? Well, the SNP would say that they can do that with things like benefits. They have some power over welfare. They have already introduced what's called the Scottish Child Payment. Sorry, that's a standalone payment. It's only made in Scotland to certain families. And the big ticket item on the cost of living, which kind of took some observers by surprise, including myself, I'll be honest. When John Swinney launched the manifesto document in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, he talked about his ambition to introduce price caps on certain food items. And at the time, on this announcement, people were kind of like do you have the power to do that? And John Swinney's argument is that the Scottish Government has powers over public health emergencies, how to respond to improve public health generally. And he could use those to work with supermarkets, because it's supermarkets that he's targeting this at. To what he kind of describes as, you would get a basket of basic essentials, things like bread, milk, so forth, and they would be set at basically a price dictated by the government. Now, there's been a lot of pushback to this from opposition parties, retailers, just kind of people that have been around a long time who've seen this policy being implemented in other places. And there's a lot of scepticism, it's fair to say, about firstly whether the government actually has the legal powers to do this, and secondly whether or not it could actually have some negative unintended consequences. We've in the records we've talked to a few think tanks, people like the IFS, and they've suggested that if you basically dictate to supermarkets what they can sell and what prices they sell, the supermarkets will go out their way not to. They'll have a very small number of those things, and they'll offset the cost of selling them at reduced prices on other items, and this could have all sorts of unintended consequences. But John Swinney's been adamant throughout this campaign that he thinks it's a good thing, and he's going to be bringing forward plans to do this. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen.
Absolutely. So what is the perception of John Swinney in Scotland then? Among the, obviously we've got the SNP voters, but then what is the general perception of what people think of John Swinney as First Minister? Is he a popular man? Is he someone who is going to sway the neutrals, I guess?
Well, I think firstly we have to say John Swinney is following Nicola Sturgeon is retired from the Scottish Parliament now. So of the new cohort of MSPs that will be returned on Thursday, John Swinney is by some distance the best known. In terms of his popularity, all the leaders of the Scottish parties in recent polls, going back quite a while, all of them kind of dip into the negative in terms of popularity. But, and it's an important but, John Swinney's numbers are still better than any of his opponents. John Swinney's got the advantage against someone like Anas Sarwar of Scottish Labour or Russell Finlay of the Scottish Conservatives. Number one, the public know who Swinney is. I mean, they generally know who Anas Sarwar is, of course, and to a lesser extent Russell Finlay. But most of the public has a firm idea of who John Swinney is and what he's about. And that, I mentioned his experience. He's been around a long time in government. He was also been around even longer in sort of party politics. I mean, remember, this isn't even John Swinney's first spell as SNP leader. He was leader back in the early 2000s, at a time when the SNP was at far lower an ebb than they are now. They were an opposition party in the Scottish Parliament. They had far fewer MSPs, they had far fewer MPs. And there were some in Scotland at that time who never thought the SNP could actually take power, but they did, and they've been a fixture at Holyrood ever since. And John Swinney's been a big part of that. I think though, it's an old cliche, but familiarity breeds contempt. So on the one hand, where it's a positive that John Swinney is very well known, been around a long time, a lot of voters that maybe previously used to vote SNP but don't anymore, or they've voted for the Labour or the Greens or the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, they look at Swinney and they say with some justification, isn't it time that somebody else had a shot? Isn't it time that there was a new party could come in and offer some fresh ideas? And that is a very potent criticism. And the SNP's tried to kind of counter that in this election campaign, because change is like the big word that all parties want to use in an election. Keir Starmer talked about it in 2024. We think back to Obama in 2008. It's a very, message that drives people. We want change. We want things to get better. But it's kind of difficult for the SNP to kind of argue that when they have been in power in Scotland for 20 years. Of course, the SNP say, well, vote for us for independence. What could be bigger? What could be a bigger change than creating, a new country or a new political apparatus separate from Westminster? But again, it comes back to, do voters really believe that independence is coming in the short to medium term? Some polling suggests the answer is no. While they might not like Keir Starmer or Labour in Westminster, they also recognise that there are a lot of big issues going on right now that maybe take priority over another constitutional row. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at just now.
So what will be the key deciding factor, in your opinion, Chris, to whether the neutral voter will be turning out for SNP on voting day?
I think the SNP, like all other parties right now, are struggling with what I can't claim credit for this term, but this election campaign, this election has been dubbed the meh election, because that's kind of been the response from voters who've been talking to pollsters, taking part in focus groups, have kind of been shrugging their shoulders, going, we don't particularly like any of them. And for very familiar reasons to anybody, that's been in a supermarket today, yesterday, you're looking at the prices of things and wincing. Inflation has been stubbornly high. The cost of living has been an issue now, 5-6 years since COVID, and since the energy market kind of went through the roof in the back of the invasion of Ukraine, and all these other big issues. Voters, a word that we've kept hearing again and again and again, the old Scots word scunnered. Politicians have been repeating that endlessly. Voters are scunnered, and they're scunnered with the cost of living. They're scunnered with low wages. They're scunnered with the condition of their local high street. And while not all of these things can be laid at the door of the SNP's long time in power at Holyrood, it does create this sort of feeling of, well, what's the point? Is anything really going to change regardless of how I vote? And I think, that's the main thing the SNP will be worried about. They know, they've looked at the polls, they know that if the polls are replicating on Thursday, they're home and dry, they'll be the biggest party, John Swinney will be the First Minister again. But, I think they are worried about how much of their core support, people that have voted with the SNP consistently for 10, 20 years, whether these people are still going to be motivated enough to actually make it to the polling station on Thursday. Because if they aren't, if there's a low turnout, particularly in some constituencies in the sort of central belt in Scotland, we might see, 2-3 horse races emerge where perhaps the SNP are up against Labour, perhaps they're up against Reform. Reform, of course, are the great unknown in this election, as they're effectively a brand new party. And I think that will be worrying John Swinney. He'll be hoping, I hope my vote turns out. He's going to win, but what's the scale of the victory? Is it going to be a majority where the SNP can govern without having to, rely on anyone else? Or is he going to be short of that, and then he has to deal with other parties, and there's a bit of horse trading involved. So yeah, it's the SNP's election to lose. It really is. They're kind of, they've got a foot in the door. They just really need to hold it open and get through, and they'll get John Swinney back, his feet under the desk and back in power. But we'll find out soon enough whether that's going to be enough.